mentioned, Bill Issel was instrumental, frankly, singularly responsible for putting together tonight's great panel. And so I want to thank Bill publicly for all of his effort in making tonight possible, and turn it over to him for introductions and for moderation. Ladies and gentlemen, the McGinty Professor here at Salve Regina University, Dr. Bill Issel. Bill.
Good evening, everyone. Is the mic working well? Can you all hear me good? Well, a warm welcome to all of you. I see some of my hardworking students. I'm so pleased to see you here. I'm pleased to see all of you. We have a wonderful threesome of experts joining us this evening. We're here tonight to explore the challenges to achieving justice and mercy, given the complex relationships among race, class, policing, prosecuting, sentencing, and incarceration in the United States today. Our panelists are experienced scholars and advisors from 3 different parts of the country. Leo Carroll from the University of Rhode Island, Alex Gerald from San Francisco State University, and Donna Murch, and pardon the order, it's strictly alphabetical, and Donna Murch from Rutgers University, New Brunswick. You have detailed information about their bios, so let me offer a brief introduction and then turn things over to our panelists. 2 years ago, the National Academy of Sciences issued a report on the growth of incarceration in the United States. Among its sobering conclusions, several stand out. The growth of incarceration rates in the U.S. over the past 40 years is historically unprecedented and internationally unique. The U.S. rate of incarceration is some 5 to 10 times higher than Western European and other democratic democracies. About 60% of those behind bars are minorities, about 2/3 Black and 1/3 Hispanic, or as we say in California, Latino. The largest impact of this increase has fallen on poor and minority men. African American men born since 1960 are more likely to have served time in prison than to have completed 4-year college degrees. African American men under the age of 35 who failed to complete high school are now more likely to have been in custody than to have been employed in the labor market. These are indeed sobering conclusions, and as we know, they've already begun to be discussed in the current presidential campaign. Our format tonight is as follows. Each of our panelists will discuss how their recent work sheds light on the complex relationships that we've identified here. And if we have time, I will pose several questions to our panelists after they have finished their presentations. Professor Carroll, would you like to begin?
Thanks, Bill. Bill asked me to talk about recent work. I'm approaching retirement, so I have about 50 years of work in this area. For 3 years in the military, I was a correctional officer at the military prison at Fort Leavenworth. And in that capacity, I was in charge of the disciplinary and administrative segregation units. Prison got in my blood, in some sense. And the experience of being a correctional officer and in subsequent years, over most of my career, having been a researcher, in fact, I spent 2 years as a quasi-inmate in our local adult correctional institution. I would go in every day, hang out with inmates, and leave at the end of the day, or at least on most days. There were a couple of days when it was kind of dicey getting out. It's pretty easy to get in, but not so easy to get out. And most recently, I have served as a consultant to the National Institute of Corrections, which is a federal agency that provides technical assistance to state corrections agencies. And in that capacity, I have been probably in somewhere in the vicinity of 40 or 50 prisons in the country, from Vermont to Florida to Texas to California and so forth. So I think I have a fairly good sense of particularly the issue of incarceration, conditions in prison, so on and so forth. I've also done some research, not as extensively as with prisons, on issues of racial profiling by police. But I think we are today in a situation in which we are really focusing nationally on the issue of mass incarceration. I'd like to address these remarks mainly to that. There's much discussion about that. I mean, it seems we've realized that we have far too many people in prison. In fact, we have 25% of the people in prison in the world are in the United States. And we have about 5% of the population. This is an enormously expensive proposition, and given the economic insecurity, there is now finally discussion after about 30 years of this of, can we reduce this population? And it does give us an opportunity now, because of the cost discussion, to actually look at ways to decrease the number of people and the rate of incarceration. I am hopeful that we can do so, but I am very skeptical that it will happen, that we will ever radically reduce the size of this population, and let me explain why. I'm old enough to have seen a number of movements to reform corrections. In the 1960s, we had the big push on rehabilitation. We were going to, in fact, adopt a medical model and treat and rehabilitate people who violate the law and return them to society as productive citizens. That was a monstrous failure. And not only was it a failure, but the impact of that in institutions was to make conditions in those institutions absolutely horrible, because authorities lost control of those institutions. Part of that movement, and the other panelists are all, either from or have substantial experience in California, which led the country in that rehabilitation experiment, and part of that was indeterminate sentencing, in which people could be sentenced to usually like 1 to 10 years, or sometimes 1 year to life. And when they would be released from that sentence would be determined by a parole board on the basis of an assessment that they were rehabilitated, okay? That led, by individualizing sentencing in that fashion, that led to substantial racial discrimination. And as rehabilitation, as became evident that rehabilitation failed, another movement arose, which was at the time called the justice model, moving us to a more retributive sentencing scheme, adopted in California and most other states around the country. And it was something that both liberals and conservatives, it was really a bipartisan kind of thing, but conservatives somehow co-opted that movement, and yes, we reduced, we took away that sentencing discretion from judges, but at the same time, we increased sentences dramatically. So that failed. And lastly, something I've been was very much involved in over the years was the and still am, the litigated reform of correctional institutions, which of all of these three movements probably had the most success in the sense that I believe, and I think I can argue successfully, that conditions in most prisons, certainly not all, but most prisons today are better than they were 25 or 30 years ago, despite the overcrowding. But that failed in the sense that states, under court orders, were given the option of how to deal with reducing overcrowding and ameliorating their conditions, as were we in the state of Rhode Island. And the result of leaving that up to the states was they just built more prisons. And so, nature abhors a vacuum in some sense, and we filled those prisons so that, in 1970 in Rhode Island, we had 500 people in prison. Today, we have about 3,200. The past 3 years have seen some decline in the numbers of people in prison, and as I have said, some see this as a major paradigm shift, that we're going to sort of rethink our sentencing and correctional policies. As I said, I'm skeptical about that. I'm skeptical because if you read what people write, if you look carefully at the rhetoric, it's all cost-benefit. It's all, this is costing too much, we could save this much by doing this, we can save that much by doing that, and so forth and so on. And so when they're talking about, particular policies, it focuses on, as they have done in several places, including California and New York City, either decriminalizing minor drug offenses or police adopting policies that they will not arrest for minor drug offenses. Or they're talking about allowing people, as we have done in Rhode Island, to earn good time, not just good time that you accumulate, by statute, but good time for program participation and so forth and so on, or being less strict in terms of revocations of probation and parole. But these kinds of things, there's nothing wrong with them, obviously. I'm very much in favor of them, but they only deal with marginal changes. They're not in themselves to have the capacity to reduce the large number of people we have in prison. And when you read the rhetoric, most of them are very careful to distinguish between something that we might call deserving offenders, that is, people who are convicted of, non-serious, non-violent crimes, minor drug offenses, and something that we might call the real criminals. Now, I think that leaves it wide open for us to continue to, among other things, racialize, if you will, our prison and so-called correctional system. Because who are the real criminals? And I'll get into that in a little bit. Or who are defined as the real criminals. But apart from that, we have seen instances in this state and in states around the country where somebody is released early from prison or is out on parole or probation and they commit a serious crime, okay, a particularly heinous crime. Those of us in Rhode Island know that what happens in Woonsocket is well known in Newport, all right, or vice versa. And you see whole programs shut down. The fact is, if you're going to release, as we are, hundreds of thousands of people, some of those people are going to commit serious and tragically some heinous crimes. And when that happens, if you're strictly speaking in terms of money, people will say, well, I want to be safe. I'll pay more money to keep them in prison. Okay? What we're not talking about here, and I go back to the title of this panel, Justice and Mercy. We're not really talking about what do we mean by justice? What do we mean by mercy? There is one thing to look at the cost-benefit analysis, but it's quite another thing to look at it from a normative point of view. Okay? Do we have justice? I mean, criminal justice is a retributive justice. It's punishing somebody for something they've done wrong. But our criminal justice system operates within this larger society. It cannot be separated from the larger society. And the fact of the matter is, we don't have a great deal of social justice. In fact, a report released just this spring by the Stanford Center for the Study of Poverty and Equality compared the United States to 21 other major countries, all of the European countries and some others, in various measures of inequality, poverty, and we came out ranked 20th out of those 21 countries. Maybe I'm wrong there. It might have been 18th. But in any event, I can't remember whether it was 18 or 20. But in any event, when you look at things like poverty and when you look at wealth inequality and income inequality and opportunities for upward mobility, what we pride ourselves on in this country, okay, we rank below in virtually every European country, virtually every other major country in the world. So when people talk about the American dream, they really should be talking about the Icelandic dream, okay? So my point is really that how much?
5.
Okay, I got plenty. In 1834, there was an amendment to the English Poor Laws, and we refer to this today as the principle of lesser eligibility. And in short, that amendment to the Poor Laws was that conditions in the poorhouses could not be any better than the conditions in which the poorest workmen outside the poorhouse lived. Now, that, as I say, that was written, an amendment to the Poor Laws in 1834. But I think we live, in some sense, by that principle. The idea behind that principle was they didn't want people who could work, who were able-bodied and could earn a living, to seek poor relief, or relief under the Poor Laws. Okay. What this means to me is we are not going to allow prisoners and formerly incarcerated people any advantages, opportunities, services, or programs that we don't provide to poor people who haven't violated the law. Which then brings us to the fact that, we have this enormous problem of poverty in this country. Okay? We have this enormous problem of inequality. So are we, going to give to prisoners things like decent medical care, college educations, first-class vocational training? Are we going to provide those kinds of things to people who violated the law when there are people who are law-abiding who don't receive them, who have to pay for them or don't get them? So I think we're not going to see a radical change in criminal justice and particularly in corrections. We're not going to bring the number of people in prison down to where it was, the rate down to where it was in the, say, early 1970s, without sort of rethinking and redoing the entire network of social services and programs and so forth that we offer to people who are law-abiding. And I'll just close with this. This is not a quote, but this thought is very much at the heart of one of the most prominent jurisprudential theories, that of John Rawls' theory of justice, who says, basically every society has to provide, as a basic human right, a fair distribution of the goods, services, programs, opportunities that are necessary for a dignified life. Not merely are necessary for life, but for a dignified life. And until we do that, I think we are going to see or continue to have the highest rate of incarceration in the world.
Thank you, Leo. Alex, can we shift on to you, please?
Sure.
Yeah.
Good evening, and thanks for coming out here. I just want to start out by saying this is my book, The Valley of the Shadow of Death, and I never had any intention of writing this book. I did not want to write this book, and did not think that I was going to write this book. And yeah, you can't wait to get it now, right? And however, one day I was in one of the most famous prisons in America, visiting, not as an inmate, and that's San Quentin. And we were on a tour with a few students from San Francisco State University, and the guard took us into the old gas chamber. It's green, kind of bathysphere, so the gas can't escape and poison the people witnessing it from the press. It's known as the Mean Green Killing Machine. And some death row guards were bantering. And what do death row guards banter about? Guys on death row. And they were talking about the most dangerous man on death row. And that's saying something. There's about 750 men on death row in San Quentin now. This was about 4 years ago, so there were only about 720 then. And I was familiar with this case. And from that moment, I couldn't stop thinking about this case. And it's a genuine tragedy and quite literally something out of all of our worst nightmares. It's a home invasion quadruple homicide. A 60-year-old woman drinking her morning coffee quite literally had her head blown off. I've looked at hundreds and hundreds of autopsy photos, and these were the worst I've ever seen. It was also 2 children shot in their sleep and a young fiance. And from that moment, I couldn't stop thinking about this case, and I started looking at it online and getting more interested in it. And my wife, I think, essentially to shut me up, said, why don't you just write a book about it? I said, well, I don't write books like this. I write books that people don't read. And and so she said, well, what would be wrong with writing one that people do read? And I said, well, let me think about this. And I couldn't sleep that night. I got so interested in the idea, and I thought, I'm going to write something. It started to develop in my head that will be in the style, and I stress in the style, I'm not saying, of Truman Capote's In Cold Blood. That is a non-fiction novel, which is a complete contradiction in terms, but basically that it would read like a novel, like a murder mystery, but everything in it would be true. And I did a little research and went down to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, where the record was there for trials regarding the case, the habeas corpus proceedings, and the guy wheeled out a cart that had conservatively 10,000 documents on it. And I'm sort of picturing myself, and it was one of those moments where I said, well, this is wonderful. I mean, what a cache, what resources. And then I thought, what the hell am I going to do with this? I'm picturing myself over some old Xerox machine, and the guy who would wheel it out was completely stoned, completely unhelpful. And when I'd call again, I'd say, can I see it? He's like, who is this? Pretending he's like, I don't know what case you're talking. Okay, so that was going to be a gold mine and a nightmare at the same time. Once I finally sorted through that, I found the stuff on disk. I thought, okay, I've got to go and contact the victim's family. And this was the really tricky part. I had no idea if the key member of the victim's family would even want to talk about this, and if he didn't, boy, do I understand. I didn't know quite how I'd approach him on it or what would happen. His name is Kermit Alexander, and if any of you are football fans in here and were football fans in the 1960s, you might have heard of him. He was All-American at UCLA, an All-Pro on the San Francisco 49ers. And I sent him a letter which was ignored, then sent him a certified letter which his daughter signed for. His wife called and sort of vetted me, and she said, he'll call you tomorrow. And I thought, okay, is he really going to call? He called. We talked for 3 hours. He said, come down. I'll meet you at the airport. We'll talk. So we set that up, went down there, and he met me at the airport, took me out to his home, and there around a big table was Kermit Alexander, sat down, and then 3 or 4 family members. And he said, you know, this is the first day. The crime took place in 1984. This is now 2012, almost 30 years later. So this is the first day we've actually come back together as a family to discuss this. We split over this crime. We haven't reconciled since, and we're coming together now. Oh, good, no pressure on me. And so I'm thinking, all right, this is incredible, and I also feel kind of inappropriate, like some type of voyeur or something. And after we talked that day, we talked some more, and he said that he and his family really wanted me to do this book. And a thing that I think makes it what it is there was an immediate just coming together that this book was going to be both intimate and grand. I was going to get access to their family. They were going to be absolutely honest with me about this thing. But it was clear to me then it stood for so much more. And I spent hundreds of hours talking with this man. And there was one time when the two of us were just seated at his dinner table, and we were talking. And he said something to me. These moments would happen over and over where I thought, oh my God, this is what this thing is all about. And he said, when I tell this story, which he told numerous times, African-American people will constantly say to me, Kermit's born in 41, so he's just turned 75. He said, that's my story. That's the same kind of thing that happened to us, not to this extreme, of course, of a quadruple homicide. And I'll just read you one little passage where I took what he said and put it in this book. One of the things that changed with the book along the way was we decided, everybody, our agent who we eventually got, the publisher and the family, that it would be more powerful if it was spoken first person. So we put it in his voice. And so here's just what I took out of that day speaking with him at his table. Look at me as a little boy, 5 years old, playing in the barn. Look at my family on their farm in southern Louisiana. working the fields till the fingers bleed. See my father sail for the South Seas to fight the Japanese. Listen to the South sing Dixie as the crosses burn and the strange fruit swings. And look at my mother as she holds my hand as we board the colored car of a westbound train in search of the future. And every time I tell this tale, someone says to me, "That's my family you're talking about. That's my story. Born of the South, flight from Jim Crow, California dreams, stark awakenings, struggle, injustice, violence, rage. This is our story. It's not about saints' lives, just ordinary folks striving for something better and what they have been forced to endure. It's about the decisions we make when shut in dark places. This is my story." And to me, that encapsulated 75 years of African American history. And Kermit would talk about his family from Louisiana, and his father was a member of a group, some of you may have heard of them, I had not until I worked on this project, called the Montford Point Marines. And they were the first African American contingent of Marines. And they would serve in the South Seas, and their job basically would be in the tail end of battles in, say, Iwo Jima or Okinawa. They would go in and try and flesh out the last Japanese resistance that wouldn't surrender. Kermit said his dad called these guys tunnel rats. And as he came back to Louisiana after the war, and he's in his Marine uniform, and he said people would stop him on the street, white people, and say, "Boy, why don't you quit impersonating a Marine? You from that Monkey Point contingent?" And his dream was to have an auto mechanic shop, and he was there sitting in a real estate office trying to get some land. And he said he sat there all day. And at the end, they said, "We don't have anything for you today." And he said, "That was it. I'm leaving." He said, "I'm getting on a train and going out west." And he became, this is probably 1946, part of the Great Migration, one of the most famous moments in 20th century African American history. And it was the dream of the West. And through this, you get insight into what an iconic image for African Americans the train was, and the West was, and Los Angeles was. And while Kermit and his father will tell you it was a lot better than Dixie, there were still lots of problems. There were real estate practices that basically ghettoized certain parts of the population. You would have a large settlement in a place that some of you may have heard of, like Watts. And Watts was actually an individual municipality at the time, and then it was joined to Los Angeles because of heavy African-American settlement and the fear that they would actually elect an African-American mayor. And Kermit's father would work in these blue-collar jobs. He worked for a long time at the Uniroyal plant, Uniroyal Tires. And in the 60s and 70s, deindustrialization starts to take place. And a lot of these jobs move out to the suburbs. A lot of these jobs move overseas. And you start to get, with this pattern, larger scale unemployment. You start to get more of the birth of these street gangs. And Kermit was one of 11 kids, and he's deciding where to go to college. He's got great football skills, and his goal, he decided at UCLA, because that's where his hero Jackie Robinson had gone. And he said, "I really want to be a sociology professor." And his coach said, "Well, you know, I got another line of work you could go into that probably pay better than a sociology professor." He said, "Why don't you go to the NFL?" And I'll just take his word for it that pays better, right? But Kermit said, "What will this do for me ultimately?" And his coach said, "You'll be able to fulfill your parents' dreams that all of those kids will be able to get an education. And he said, that sold me. He said, also, you can get your father out of debt. And Kermit goes to the NFL. He's up in San Francisco. Comes back, finishes with the Rams. And then one day in 1984, August 31st, he gets a phone call. And it's his brother. And he simply says on the phone, Kermit, can you tell me why anybody would mess up Mom like that? He said, Neil, what are you talking about? He said, something real bad here happened. And Kermit drives over there, and the whole way he's thinking, this can't be real, this can't be real. He gets there, the gurneys are being wheeled out of the house. And just to let you know how extraordinary this crime was, this is in the jurisdiction that was taken by, if you know anything about LA, 2 different police departments, either Newton or the 77th. Newton's nickname is Shootin' Newton, and the 77th is Violent Men for a Violent Society. These guys came out of the house with tears in their eyes. No one knew what had happened. No motive could be found. It's a genuine murder mystery. And this gets me into a few of the kind of guts of this book. One is what this kind of violence does to the psyche of the victims, their family, the neighborhood. The intimate part of this book, I've given you a lot of the Great Migration, Jim Crow, World War II. The intimate is, it just rips people apart. They have no idea, and we go intimately into this. Why did this happen to us? Who did this? And a common enemy can unite a family or a group or a nation if you know who the enemy is. When you don't know who it is, it just splinters you. And everybody in the family starts pointing fingers. And they say, Kermit, you must have had something to do with this. And here his mom's been murdered, his nephew has been murdered. And they're saying, you must have had something to do with it. You're the star of the family. We can't figure anything out. And they're looking back to like voodoo hexes from Louisiana. Maybe there was some clan grudge from the 1940s. Nobody can figure out anything that's going on. And Kermit is ripped with guilt. And he's just saying, what could I have done to prevent this? And it takes on somewhat of the nature of a Greek tragedy, in that it does come back to actually something that Kermit played a role in. He was very, very involved in community building and reaching out to kids. And there was a kid that at one point he saw playing football when he sponsored a Pee Wee League team. And he said, that kid's amazing, but he can't control himself. Somebody needs to help that kid. And he said everybody stood up and said, yeah, you're right. Nobody did anything. Kermit said it's like an old African proverb. When you point one finger at somebody else, you point 3 back at yourself. And it would be that kid that would end up on a completely false pretense wiping out that family 10 years later. It's a Greek tragedy. And the book then goes into the whole struggle of redemption that a victim has. And I'll just end here in my last minutes with 3 points about how this book concludes. One, I would just say, if you ever got a project that grabs you and won't let you go, don't let it let you go. It's doing that for a reason. And we ended up having the release party for the book at the site of the old Uniroyal plant where his father worked. It's now a shopping mall. And Kermit will always say, you know, that deindustrialization is huge in the way neighborhoods fell apart. But that doesn't end how the people viscerally feel who are victimized by that crime and the people who did it. Second point I'll make, I spoke to people in this that I never thought I'd talk to. I spent hours and hours talking to prison guards. I actually had a pass to get into San Quentin. I went out there so often. That's a weird thing to have. I don't know if it's good or bad, but it's weird, all right? And we spent dozens of hours talking to prison guards. LAPD, gangbangers on the streets. We ended up in Haiti talking to people, going to Louisiana. And if you just listen, and all I ever do is talk. Professors, they talk and talk. But you stop and you just listen. It's amazing how profound it is, even what sounds simple that people say. The last thing I'll say about this book is it just changed the way I viewed life, that someone could actually come out of this. And he ended up getting redemption in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And I'll leave you in my remaining minute here with that moment. He's down there with his wife, and they're doing relief work in Haiti. This 25 years after the crime. And they fall in love with a little boy that they want to adopt from an orphanage in Haiti. And they see him one day when they're going back, and he's playing with some friends. And Kermit says, Clifton, that's the little boy's name. Who are your friends? Clifton's about 8 years old. He said, those aren't my friends. 4 of them. He says, those are my brothers and sisters. Uh-oh. And the oldest boy, who's about 10, 11, 12, I guess he's 12 at the time, he says to Kermit, he says, you know, I see you got a camera with you. Could you take a picture of us for the last time? Because I know you're going to take Clifton away from us and we'll never see him again. Oh, boy. Tears start flowing, and Kermit looks at his wife, and he says, if we take one, we take them all. They adopt 5 kids from Haiti. And to me, if we're talking about a panel of mercy, of justice, this to me is what it's all about. It's guilt has to be slain, but it's not slain by revenge. It's through just a heartfelt struggling with what you've done. And he said when he saw that little boy in Haiti, I'll never let another little boy down again and let something happen. I lost 4 lives, and they'll never be brought back. But by giving these 5 kids a chance, maybe I can do my part for justice and for mercy. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. Donna?
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I wanted to thank Professor Issel for inviting me. It's been wonderful seeing him again. He has been teaching San Francisco Bay Area history and California history for a very long time, and I met him when I was first starting graduate school, and it takes me back to a time when I first started thinking about studying California, and then later about the kinds of themes I'll be talking about today. I want to start with a story that is kind of foundational in my mind for when I started thinking about writing a book on crack and the war on drugs in Los Angeles. My first book was about the Black Panther Party, and I'm going to say a little bit about that because this is the 50th anniversary of the Panthers. It's approaching on October 15th, 2016. That'll be the 50th anniversary of the founding. And in many ways, the history of the Panthers is deeply resonant today because of the Black Lives Matter movement and this larger movement against anti-state sanctioned violence. So we're in a moment of Black youth protest that invokes the spirit of the 1960s, of the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party. And many of you may have seen that often young people in Black Lives Matter wear T-shirts that say, Assata taught me. And what that means is that Assata Shakur, who was a member of the New York Black Panther Party, she wrote a powerful, beautiful autobiography called Assata. That's who they're referring to. So a lot of Panther imagery is contained in the protests that we're seeing now, and sometimes it's named explicitly and sometimes it's not. So in 2006, I was working on my book, Living for the City, which is the history of the Black Panther Party. And after the book was published in 2010, some of the people that were in the book invited me out to the Bay Area, and I had my first book party at a public library in Oakland, which to me was the perfect place to have a book party because it was about the public infrastructure of public universities and the importance of state resources for that generation of young people. So for me, that was the perfect place to have it, was in the Oakland History Room in this wonderful public library. And afterwards, there was a gathering in someone's house, and we were all sitting around talking and discussing, and there were a lot of people from San Francisco State, from the San Francisco State Student Strike, which established one of the earliest ethnic studies programs and black studies programs in the country. And we were all sitting around and talking and reminiscing. And then one of the activists in the book told me this story, and it just really kind of, it made such an impression on me that I spent literally years afterwards thinking about it. And it's ultimately what motivated me to write a book on crack in Los Angeles. And this was a story. The Congressman Ron Dellums was elected as mayor. He retired from the Congress and then ran for mayor in the city of Oakland in 2006. And when he was elected, he had a celebration afterwards, and he invited a lot of his long-term political friends, allies, and major constituencies in the city of Oakland, which is where the Black Panther Party was formed. And a lot of these were people from the 1960s. There's an organization called the Afro-American Association, which was the first black nationalist organization in California. And it was this study group that was formed at UC Berkeley by really the first generation of black college attendees. And so this links to what Dr. Gerald was talking about and thinking about the Great Migration, that really our first true generation of black students attends universities in the 1960s. You have individuals before that, but you don't really have full cohorts until the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. So people from the Afro-American Association were there, local business people, clergy, and there was also, they'd invited youth activists, because Oakland has such a strong tradition of activists. And essentially, this was an organizing meeting for all these different constituencies to talk to Ron Dellums about what they wanted from the city. So they went around and, each group named what they wanted. And then they came to the youth activists who were 14 years old. This is in 2006. And they asked them what they wanted. And they said they wanted grief centers. And everyone in the room was just dumbfounded by what they meant by that, grief centers. And they asked them, what do you mean you want grief centers? And they said that, we are coming of age, many of us are in our teens, and our parents have been taken from us. And many of our grandparents are elderly and they're getting sick and we're losing them. And we feel that before we can even begin to talk about things that we want constructively for our lives, we have to grieve for what's happened. And the adults were just utterly surprised and devastated to hear 14-year-olds talk about needing grief centers. And what was interesting about this also is that they didn't say grief therapy or grief counseling. They said centers. In other words, this was a collective experience, a social experience. Often we hear the word community center, right? We think of it as a place to go, and that's what they were expecting for people to ask for, dance classes or midnight basketball or, community-based programs. And so that set me on a path about trying to think about the generation coming of age in 2006. And now many of these young people are in their mid to late 20s, precisely the kinds of young people that are protesting right now in the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I spent time thinking about what happened after the Civil Rights and Black Power movement. I myself am born at the tail end of the Black Power movement, and it's a time that's familiar to me, the music, the sensibility. My father was in CORE. So I had a definite sense of that era and coming of age in the 1970s and 1980s. But I, one generation older than they are, came of age under Ronald Reagan, and with the real intensification of the war on drugs. And they, in turn, are coming of age under Barack Obama. But there was an experience between my parents' generation, me in the middle, and theirs that had produced such a sense of mourning among black youth. And I embarked on researching this and trying to think about the response to the Black Power movement in the United States. So to give you some background to this, and what I would say is that I'm going to provide you with a political interpretation about mass incarceration, because I think that the history of the criminalization of African Americans, of Native Americans, and other marginal groups is a long continuity of American history. When you look at the colonial period and some of the oldest prisons in the United States, they disproportionately incarcerated African Americans. So that experience of incarceration is not new. But this thing that we call mass incarceration that Professor Issel was referring to, that has ultimately resulted in of African American men born after 1960 more being sent to prison than graduating from university. That is a new historical phenomena, and it really starts in the mid-'70s. And I think in order to understand it, you have to look at the politics of the country, because the long-term issues of poverty and exclusion have been there from the very beginning, tracing it back to the origins of African presence in the Americas. But with the post-war period, you see a mass mobilization of African Americans in order to demand rights and inclusion in American society. So overwhelmingly, up until World War II, 80% of the black population is living in the South. So the black population is essentially disfranchised since the end of Reconstruction in the 19th century. So with this fight for, we call it the African American freedom struggle, they're fighting for political rights, for the right to vote. And then also, particularly in the North, they are fighting for social rights. They're saying, we are citizens, we have economic rights. That means that we should have full access to public universities. We should be included within the Social Security Act. So you know that in the New Deal, African Americans essentially were kept out of the New Deal programs because the two primary categories of work, agricultural worker and domestic worker, were kept out of the New Deal. So up until the 1960s, most African Americans don't even benefit from Social Security and other forms of social welfare provision. So much of the fight in the North is about saying we should have full access to the state, not only political rights, but also social rights. And this fight leads to a real transformation of the United States. It's a transformation of political culture. African Americans really don't win the right to vote until 1965. That is very recent. That's in the last half century in a country that had the elimination of suffrage restrictions starting in the early 19th century. So this fight for African American inclusion is a very recent one. And there are many struggles that transform ideas of citizenship. They transform our public institutions. We see the creation of African American studies, of ethnic studies. Even the interdisciplinary studies model comes out of this partial fight for black power and black inclusion. So in many ways, the civil rights and the Black Power movement, I think, is one of the great triumphs of American history. It is a story of inclusion and expansion of citizenship rights. But the period that follows civil rights and black power is the beginning of mass incarceration. And one of the things that's very disturbing about the history of mass incarceration is that it emerges just at the tail end of African American struggles for inclusion. And we see precisely the kinds of populations, black youth, especially in the cities, who are criminalized in the war on drugs and the wars on crime that emerge, starting with the launching of the Great Society by Lyndon Johnson in 1964. You have the launching of the War on Poverty, which was a very important period in American history for expanding social welfare provision and providing monies and support for communities to organize themselves. But what also starts with the War on Poverty is the war on crime. And it starts out as a relatively small program. It strengthens anti-juvenile delinquency efforts, and it's linked to social welfare provision. But with the election of Richard Nixon in 1968, who runs on a platform of law and order, and he explicitly talks about the protests that are going on, starting with the Watts Rebellion in 1965, also the precursor to it in Harlem in 1964. But he talks about disorder in the country, and he runs on a platform of restoring order. So it is a direct response to black protest. And you have the passage, first under the Johnson administration, and then the expansion under the Nixon administration of the Omnibus Crime Bill. And we see the creation of new federal agencies like the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, which is the federal agency that provides money both for the building of prisons and for the expansion of local policing. And in the early 70s, the expansion of the LEA is vastly expanded. So the federal government begins to provide provide money to states all over the country to build more prisons and to expand their police forces. And this steadily increases and advances over the last 50 years. So you have Richard Nixon declaring a war on drugs in 1971, and you have the establishment of the DEA in 1973, and you see the building of a whole new federal infrastructure that is going to support local crime-fighting efforts. Now, one interpretation of this is that it's a response to increase in crime. That's the very common interpretation. But many historians of my generation are contesting that and are arguing that this was not a response to crime, this was a political response to the transformation of the United States. And one of the best evidence, I think, for this is looking at the history of the militarization of policing. So the Watts Rebellion in 1965, it takes place in August, first week in August in 1965. We just passed the 50th anniversary last year in August. I was actually in Watts to be there for it. It was a really remarkable thing to meet people that lived in Watts and all of the families that have lived there in that long history of continuity. But so Watts at that time is the largest civil disturbance in the history of the United States. And the response to Watts was mass criminalization. So Watts is this very poor city that Martin Luther King called the most densely populated city in the world, which was an exaggeration, but he experienced it as a place of incredible density and extreme segregation, where you have a population that's 98% black, a police force that is nearly all white, and you have one of the poorest areas in the city. So protest breaks out there, and it's really a shift from the history of nonviolent civil disobedience in the South to armed protest in the North, and you see direct confrontations with police. The scale of Watts is so large that the smoke rising from the fires in Watts makes it impossible for planes to fly into LAX. So this is a profound encounter. And the response to it is that the Los Angeles Police Department arrests between 4,000 and 5,000 people. So mass arrests with essentially police going door to door to check to see if people had looted, and if they'd looted, then people being arrested. So it was a profound state response to protest. In 1967, Daryl Gates, who was the lieutenant of William Parker, founds the SWAT, Strategic Weapons Assault Team, was the initial name. And this was the first new type of commando unit founded by the LAPD, and it was composed entirely of former Vietnam veterans. And it was created because of the fears of urban rebellions. And it's first used against the Black Panther Party in Southern California in 1969, and then is used again against the SLA in 1974. But SWAT represented a new type of militarized policing. And we've talked a lot about militarized policing in response to the protests that we saw in Ferguson starting in 2014. But the germ of SWAT actually came out of a political response to the fear of urban disorder and also of political organization in Los Angeles. And Los Angeles is this very important site for this militarization of policing, the creation of new types of agencies that start out with a political response to these urban protests and political organizations, but ultimately SWAT is really expanded by the second war on drugs in the Reagan administration. So today, we have a reality TV called Dallas SWAT, and SWAT has become a normal part of American policing, but its origins go back into the 1960s. So I think interjecting issues, as Professor Carroll did about economics are important, but also the political background behind why we have expanded prisons, why we have expanded policing, why we have seen this mass criminalization of African Americans. To fast forward, I think that we are in a very interesting time right now because we're seeing a time of contestation. And it's so often, as we see in American history, the people that are best equipped to challenge a system are the ones who are most affected by it. So this generation that I was talking about, that we see, who are talking about the grieving of what mass incarceration has meant, because of course it's meant the mass criminalization of people's parents, the breaking up of families, the incredible loss of wealth, the permanent exclusion from the legal economy. Because the collateral consequence of a felony conviction is that you can't get a job in the legal economy. So in addition to people being immobilized or imprisoned, the problem is that when people are released from prison, that it's very difficult for them to find employment. So there are ways in which the process of incarceration permanently excludes people from the legal economy, which in turn creates the conditions for further activity that leads to criminalization. So this has had immense collateral consequences. One of the things that's interesting about what's happening right now is that we have seen sustained protest that we could date its origins. There's been lots of African-American mobilization against criminalization, against mass incarceration. But I began to see a new spirit emerge really after the acquittal of Zimmerman and the Trayvon Martin killing. That in 2011, this is when you saw a mass demonstration in the streets. I live in New York City. And there were demonstrations that went on for hours and hours, and Times Square was actually shut down for 6 hours, if you can imagine, with tens of thousands of people in the street in a spontaneous protest that all sat down in Broadway, Times Square area, and blocked the entire center of Manhattan for 6 hours. And it was at that moment that the three founders of Black Lives Matter, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors, they had an exchange in social media that led to the founding of the hashtag Black Lives Matter. But that was in response to the Trayvon Martin protests. And then you saw this building sense of protest, both in the streets and in social media. And then there was the shooting of Michael Brown in St. Louis, in Ferguson, which is a municipality north of St. Louis. And what made that very significant was that there had been many police shootings, but in response to this police shooting, young people came out and they stayed and they began to protest. And one of the things that triggered it is that when Michael Brown was shot, he was shot in a housing development called Canfield Green, which is 10 minutes north of St. Louis. My entire family lives in St. Louis, and so I know the city very well. And when he was shot in this area, and it's described as a street, but it's really not a street. It's more like a lane in the middle of a housing development. And his body was left in the street for 4.5 hours. And so that alone, that image of this 18-year-old who'd been shot and left, and emergency vehicles weren't called, he was just left there. People began to gather, and they also took Instagram photos of the body, and they sent it out through Twitter and through social media. And that radiated out first through Canfield Green, then through North St. Louis, through St. Louis, and then outward from St. Louis into the rest of the country and the rest of the world. And what's interesting about it having happened in St. Louis is that St. Louis is a very conservative city in many ways. The Black community there is also quite conservative. But the response of young people themselves, they came out to protest Michael Brown, and they stayed there, and they started counting the days. The first day of protest was day 1, then day 2, and they're still counting the days. A year and a half later. So what made Ferguson important wasn't just that someone was killed, it was a sustained protest against it, and that's why we know about Ferguson. And of course we know there have been protests in Baltimore, in Cleveland, and all over the country. But I think I have a slightly more hopeful perspective about mass incarceration. Looking at the current protests are very important, and seeing how mass incarceration and the fight against it has become central to the presidential election. I just saw the debate in Flint. And I've been involved in writing about mass incarceration. I, kind of in conjunction with some other activists and scholar activists who write about mass incarceration wrote a piece on the Clintons' war on drugs, which is about the war on drugs in the 1990s. And one thing that we might talk about in question and answer period that I think makes mass incarceration very thorny as a political issue is that it has been a bipartisan effort. The Republican Party is best known for its criminalization campaigns, so starting with Richard Nixon, expanded under Ronald Reagan, and then under George Bush. But the truth is the largest period of incarceration took place in terms of sheer numbers under the Clinton administration from 92 to 2000. You had 600,000 people were put in federal and state prison, and you had the passage of the crime bill in 1994 that added 60 new death penalty offenses to the added 60 new offenses to the federal death penalty. So the question about how we talk about this process of criminalization, how we develop activism in order to roll back the process of criminalization, and also to remember that the vast majority of people that are in prison are there for nonviolent crimes, many of them for low-level drug offenses. So part of what's required is an optic that looks at people, that restores their humanity and thinks about the vulnerabilities of people that have been incarcerated. Almost everyone who is in prison is poor, and many people lack education and access. And as Professor Issel mentioned, 60% of our prison population is Black and Latino, which is a population today that makes up less than 30%. And places like Southern California, the rate of Black criminalization is 3.5 times their population in the general public. So I think restoring the full humanity of people that have been incarcerated and thinking about ways to provide alternate explanations than crime as the optic that we understand for the causes of mass incarceration. So talking about some of the politics and the utility that anti-crime campaigns played in our presidential elections is very important. And I'm excited to see that really for the first time in our history, we're having a critical debate about the war on crime and the human damage that it's wrought. Thank you.
Thank you, all three. I do have a question, but I'm going to, since Professor Murch began to address the question I was going to pose to all three panelists, go straight to your questions so that we can bring you into the conversation. So, who would like to begin?
I'm going to bring the mic around.
So, is this on?
Yeah.
All right. So my question for you is, what role, if any, do you see private prisons playing within the landscape of mass incarceration and recidivism in general?
I think they play, in terms of the actual numbers of people in private prisons, it's about 10% of the prison population. But if we take the private, I mean, and this is something that's gone hand in hand with mass incarceration, has been the privatization of prisons. Not only do we have prisons that are built and managed by profit-making corporations, but if you look at any prison and look at the programs and services that are provided to prisoners, much of it now is done by for-profit organizations. So privatization is a big factor. One of my concerns is that we have these very large profit-making corporations, the largest being the Corrections Corporation of America, who build and operate prisons, as I've said. What they have done is, I mean, they're interested in the profit. So what they really do, they don't take the high-risk people, okay? They take the low-risk people and leave the high-risk people to the state, okay, which then sort of makes our prisons more expensive than per person than they need to be. But in the long run, you see, they have a vested interest in keeping their beds full, all right? And they have a very strong lobby in the states and in Washington, D.C., in Congress. If you're going to save money with prisons, you know, let us just take an example here, Rhode Island, very small system. Have about 3,200 people. If we let 200 people go, release, we're not going to save any money. Because the fact is, you have to close a section of the prison to save money. If I let, you know, 20% of a cell block out, I still have to have the heat. I still have to have, excuse me, the air conditioning. I have to have the medical care. I have to have the food. You know, I have to have the custodial care, and that's most of your budget. You don't save money until you close actual facilities. Okay, and one of the reasons for my skepticism, as I mentioned earlier, is that you have groups like Cornell Cox and Wagon Hut and Corrections Corporation of America who don't want to see that happen. And you have, as they have, you know, people in California think they've got the toughest guards union, correctional officers union in the country. They don't. We have it here in Rhode Island. Believe me, I know. I'm an honorary member of the California Correctional Peace Officers Association, honorary. The union, California, no, the Rhode Islanders union won't have anything to do with me. California didn't know me. But until, you know, we can actually close facilities, we don't save money. And the unions and the private corporations are going to be in the forefront of resistance of that.
Can I add something to that, which is that I think it's important when we talk about incarceration that we also include immigrant detention.
Yes.
Because if you include immigrant detention, 40% of the federal prison population is there, and it's overwhelmingly housed in private prisons. And one of the reasons that immigrant detention is profitable, the discussion that I've heard about public versus private prisons, for the reasons Professor Carroll was talking about, is that the housing prisoners who have been convicted in the criminal justice system is quite expensive, and it was very hard for these corrections corporations to earn profits, but they found immigrant detention to be incredibly profitable, which is to me always even a very disturbing thing to say, because you ask why. Why is it profitable? Because they're not the same constitutional protections of the prisoners' rights. And if anyone has seen pictures of what immigrant prisons look like, these are true carceral camps, and that's why they're profitable. So I think it's important to include our system of border militarization, of the undocumented population, and the criminalization of people without citizenship, because that is an immense portion of the term that I like to use is carceral state, which is a term that's taken from Foucault, from Discipline and Punish. It's a Latin term that means comes from the word prison. And it's not just to use a fancy term. It's a way to talk about all the different apparatuses of the state that are involved in punishment. So that can be both prisons and policing in jails, but it also includes things like mandatory confinement in asylums or in mental health hospitals, but also punitive things in social welfare. So, for example, in the 1970s, you see the Department of Welfare instituting systems of surveillance like 1-800 numbers where you can report your neighbor if they buy a coffee table because they're not supposed to if they have AFDC. That is also part of the carceral state, as are things like the school-to-prison pipeline.
Alex, did you have something to add to that? Other questions?
Mr. Gerald, is it?
Gerald, yeah,
Gerald.
that's fine.
I think if I heard you correctly, there's 750 prisoners in death row in San Quentin.
Approximately, yes.
And could you give us when was the last execution of a prisoner in California?
California right now is experiencing a kind of informal moratorium. The last official execution was in February of 2006, so 10 years ago.
Okay, and this is just historic. Who was the governor at that time?
The governor at that time would have been Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Oh, the Terminator.
Yeah.
Ironic.
The governator.
Governor.
The governor.
And what sort of crimes have they committed? Are these drug offenses,
No,
or are they murders?
To be on death row in California, it has to be a first-degree murder with special circumstances. So it would be, for example, killing a police officer, 2 or more victims, lying in wait, torture, murder. There's the special circumstances are listed by statute, and there's dozens of them actually. But that's the only way you're on death row in California.
These would be pretty heinous crimes.
They are.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. Professor, is it Gerald? Did you say was this okay?
Oh, we can go with whatever you want. Everybody else does. So I'm a man without a name. Yeah.
Oh, all right. I'll accept that. With respect to criminal profiling, which seems to have an ebb and flow in this country, I'm wondering currently what the public feeling is relative to criminal profiling and what the policing arm is across the country relative to criminal profiling.
Okay. It's a pretty broad question. I would say a lot of the answer to that would depend on what you mean by profiling and the audience you're addressing. And so what I mean by that is criminal profiling is good and is what every police officer should be doing, as long as they're profiling based on actions and behaviors that they can articulate with either reasonable suspicion or probable cause that a crime is about to be happening or is happening. Racial profiling, which is often confused in the term, is a practice that everyone is going to condemn, doing it simply based upon the race and not the conduct of the individual in question. And there have been various studies conducted by both private and public agencies that come out with different results on this, sometimes surprising. Sometimes the results do indicate that it looks like people of a given racial group were stopped more frequently than members that were not of that racial group. Sometimes you can break that down and say, okay, it was based on the conduct. Sometimes it is harder to document that it was based on the conduct, and that's when it looks more heinous and that it's being misused, if that answers your question.
Yeah, jump in, yeah.
Yeah, I've done some research recently on racial profiling. Certainly reviewed the literature. It is very hard to document, but I think the idea, I just want to correct, the idea that the police are out there as some sort of KKK organization looking for people of color to stop and harass is it's an inaccurate and in some sense, though I don't know this is the correct term, naive view. It's far more subtle than that. What is going, I mean, not to say that there aren't police officers who are like that, there certainly are. But the majority of racial profiling occurs from what psychologists call an implicit bias, which is basically an almost unconscious predisposition that comes from stereotypes that we have of people of color, which are generated by the media, which are generated, news that are certainly in the police officer's experience, often generated by that experience of associating blackness with crime, blackness with dangerousness, and my research concerns searching and frisking people after traffic stops. And what I find is that the bias occurs largely in terms of frisking, not, by which I mean, I'm not a lawyer. Dr. Gerald also is a lawyer, I believe, but the external pat-down, the police officer has a right to do that if he has an articulable suspicion that the person is armed and it is, for his protection. What I find in my research is that, you see, but to do a search, he has to have probable cause. And probable cause has a higher threshold of evidence required. And it takes more time to process that information. My conclusion is basically that most of this bias is almost unconscious, instinctual response based upon a stereotype that associates blackness with crime and violence, which is perpetrated, to go back to the things that you were talking about, began with Richard Nixon, and certainly, was used by George Bush and Willie Horton in 1988. So we have this, and police officers have that. They may not even be conscious of it, but that triggers that response when they sense that after a traffic stop, this may be a danger to themselves.
Could I say something quickly? I was just looking up the stats for stop and frisk in New York, and for 2011, 51% of people that were stopped and stop and frisk, 51% were black, 33% were Latino, and 9% were white. And the black population of New York is 23%, and the Latino population is 29%. When you look at practices like stop and frisk in New York, it's been very clearly established that there's deep racial bias involved in it. And that's why, we had an entire mayoralty that partially hinged on the discriminatory nature of stop and frisk. So I would talk about this in terms of institutional racism. These are practices of agencies, of organizations, and they have structural patterns to them that can be documented by statistics.
I have a question, I think probably for Dr. Carroll. What percentage of our prison population is mentally ill, and what effect did deinstitutionalization have on our prison population? And how does that compare to other countries also?
Well, I can answer the first part of your question. I don't think I can answer the second part, but maybe some of the other panelists can. One of the things that I think is absolutely necessary in this country is to refund community mental health clinics. Right now, our prisons are the largest provider of psychiatric care in the country. Probably, it's estimated, it's hard to know precisely, but the best figures I have seen from the Bureau of Prisons is that approximately 40% of the prisoners in our institutions have serious mental health issues, and that somewhere between 10 to 25% of them are acutely psychotic. It contributes the sad, the tragic thing about this is that when we put somebody with a serious mental health issue into a prison, they cannot comply with the regimentation. They are the most likely people to be victimized in terms of sexual assaults and other kinds of assaults. When they don't comply to officers' orders, they become labeled, officers are not nurses or physician's assistants. They're essentially, in some sense, police officers, maybe even not even police officers. They're trying to deal with, quote unquote, and I don't like the term, inmates. That can escalate into a situation. So a large portion of your mentally ill prisoners end up in what most people call solitary confinement, which is actually, thankfully, a misnomer, but administrative segregation, in which they are kept out of the general population and have very, very limited programming, and they might be in there for years. And that kind of lack of stimulation, lack of interaction with other people, lack of programming, lack of treatment, they deteriorate. And some of those will be let out, some of those folks will be let out of prisons, without treatment. And I think we could prevent a lot of that, because I think the deinstitutionalization, not in and of itself, but the fact that community mental health clinics, which were initially in this state greatly, well-funded and well-run, now have lost that funding and are a skeleton of what they were. And these people would not be in prison, I think, or many of them would not, if we had those clinics back to where they should be.
I would very much like to invite more questions, but I'm afraid we are out of our time. And I want to thank all of you for your attendance and your questions, and good night to all.